This is the story of an urban railroad that ran from downtown Minneapolis to the docks on Lake Minnetonka in Excelsior. And an excursion steamboat that sailed on Lake Minnetonka and finished her life in the deep waters of Lake Yellowstone. The key player in this story is Colonel William McCrory. He was born in Guernsey County, Ohio, a town and county about halfway between Columbus, Ohio and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was born July 20, 1839. When the Civil War broke out, McCrory was attending Oberlin College, a Presbyterian school back in the day. He enlisted in the Army, and by October 18, 1862 he was a second lieutenant in the 7th Independent Company of Ohio Sharpshooters. He reported for training at Camp Cleveland. McCrory was then promoted to a first lieutenant on November 11, 1862. This is his unit, the 7th Company, Ohio Independent Sharpshooters. The officer in the right front is probably Lieutenant McCrory. Together with the 5th, the 6th, and the 8th, they made up the battalion called the 1st Ohio Sharpshooters. The sharpshooter's weapon was the Spencer repeating rifle. It was designed by Christopher Spencer. It was produced from 1860 to 1869 and then discontinued as the Winchester lever-action rifle, with many features from the 1860 Henry became a weapon of choice. The Spencer was 7-shot, using metallic cartridge bullets. The 1st Ohio was assigned to the Army of the Cumberland and attached to headquarters, first under General Rosecrans and later General Thomas. The 1st Ohio Battalion's fame came on September 20, 1863 at the Battle of Chickamauga. The 1st had become detached from headquarters as General Rosecrans and General Crittenden withdrew. In close proximity was Union General Jefferson C. Davis, not to be confused with Confederate States of America President Jefferson F. Davis. Under General Davis's command, the 1st formed a line, then retreating and reformed 3 more times, pouring deadly fire from their 7-shot Spencers into Confederate divisions under Hindman and Johnson. Today you can visit the monument to the 1st on the western edge of the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. On May 20, 1864, the 7th Independent Company was separated from the rest of the 1st Ohio Battalion and became General Sherman's personal bodyguard. William McCrory had risen to the rank of captain and was in command of the 7th. The captain stayed with Sherman's headquarters attachment through the Atlanta campaign and the march to the sea. Then was absent from Savannah to Bentonville, North Carolina, where General Joseph Johnston surrendered, the largest Confederate surrender of the war. Captain McCrory did march in the Grand Review of the Armies on May 23 and 24, 1865 in Washington City, as Washington, D.C. was called then. At the end of the war, Captain McCrory mustered out as a captain and went home to Ohio. But by 1867 he were brevetted to a colonel. The author believes the brevetment was in the Ohio militia and probably by the governor of Ohio. He is recognized as a captain in regards to the U.S. Army but goes by colonel at other times. Another person McCrory knew was General John Sprague. On July 22, 1864, during the Battle of Atlanta, General Sprague was in command of a half of an artillery battery and a brigade of infantry. He held off a corps of cavalry under Confederate General Joseph Wheeler at Decatur, Georgia. Sprague was charged with protecting the supply trains of the Army of the Tennessee and the Army of the Ohio. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his valor, but not until after his death in 1893. Although not explicit in the record, the author believes McCrory's sharpshooters were sent from Sherman's headquarters unit to help Sprague. Sprague came to Minnesota shortly after the war and took over as general manager of the Winona and St. Peter Railroad Company. The Winona and St. Peter was one of the oldest railroads in the West, with track being laid down in 1861. Back when it was chartered, in 1857, before the days of rip-rapping the banks of the Mississippi River to define the channel, Winona, Minnesota was considered the most northern town on the Mississippi River that was open well more than half the year to boat traffic that drew 3 feet of water or less. The dream of the Winona and St. Peter Railroad was a railway that started in Milwaukee on the east terminus going west into the Dakota Territory. It never made it east of the Mississippi but did get to Watertown, South Dakota. We will hear more about General Sprague later in this narrative. This photograph was taken in 1870 from the Winslow House on the east side of the Mississippi River. By then St. Anthony Falls, the actual falls, not the town, was the most northern navigation point on the Mississippi River, replacing Winona. Minneapolis and St. Paul were northern railway hubs. In addition, Minneapolis was a boom town with lumber and flour where a smart man with gumption could become rich. It appears to be late summer in this photograph. The river is down. It would not be for another 27 years when the St. Anthony Dam was finished that the water level would raise level around Nicollet Island as indicated by the blue line. The previous year's logs are just about finished being processed. It may be hard to see, but the Father Louis Hennepin suspension bridge is on the right. Most of the flour mills were below the falls. The falls was a problem for floated logs, so most of the lumber processing was above the falls. Here is a photograph of St. Anthony Falls showing the use of the river to produce hydropower for the mills. Here is an 1874 map of Minneapolis. With the east being the top of the map, nothing looks right. Let's change it. Better. Back in 1874, the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad and the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroads in part shared the same right-of-way. The tracks crossed the Mississippi on the railroad bridge on the north side of Nicollet Island, then west on what is now called the Cedar Lake Trail. The other trackage was the Milwaukee and Minneapolis Railroad, nicknamed the Flour Mill Road, that went down Hiawatha Avenue, and a spur followed the river to Fort Snelling. On the east side of the Mississippi was the beginnings of railroad yards, including the Minneapolis and Duluth Railroad. For reference, here is the University of Minnesota. It actually became a university, not just a college, in 1869. The first 2 students graduated in 1873. Here is Nicollet Island, and here is roughly the commercial downtown Minneapolis area. In 1878, Colonel McCrory came to Minneapolis, Minnesota. He dabbled in real estate, but with advancement in motorized transportation, he came up with the idea of an urban railroad that would go into the neighborhoods like the horse lines, but it would be called the motor line. The city had horse lines, that is, horse-drawn streetcars on rails on mostly dirt street, as shown in this photograph of the Minneapolis Street Railway. The dirt street wasn't that bad for horse incontinence, but like many cities, the leaders want to pave the streets with bricks. The brick street were okay for horse urine, it just went through the cracks and down to somewhere, but horse manure smelled and was a mess. It required street cleaners, but a motorized streetcars would be clean. Colonel McCrory's idea gained investors, and by 1879 the motor line was a grand adventure. One route would go from downtown to the Lyndale neighborhood. Another would go to Minnehaha Falls. A third route all the way to the edge of the city in what now is known as the Tanglewood neighborhood. But the most grand route was to the lakes. First to Calhoun, then to Harriet, then all the way to Lake Minnetonka in Excelsior. The Minnetonka Lake Run would now be an enjoying days excursion rather than an overnighter. Here is an enlarged map that will show the motor line's routes. It started at Bridge Square, where the Federal Building and Post Office are today. Then southeast on 1st Street to South 1st Avenue. Today South 1st Avenue is called Marquette Avenue. Then southwest on 1st Avenue to Grant Street. Then a short jog over to Nicollet Avenue, and then south into the Lyndale neighborhood. A small round table and repair garage was at the southeast corner of South Nicollet Avenue and West 31st Street. Today, 142 years later, the corner is still a mass transit usage, but back then there was not a barricaded police station across the street. Nicollet Avenue and West 31st was the hub of the motor line. The east route continued down Nicollet to 37th Street. Then east to Hiawatha Avenue. Then southeast to the Minnehaha Falls Park. Within a year after the motor line got to Minnehaha Fall, the old soldiers' home was built on the eastern edge of the park overlooking the Mississippi River. The southern route continued down Nicollet Avenue to an area called Washburn Park, now known as Tanglewood. It is too long of a story to get into, but about 1895 the area became known as Tanglewood because of the winding streets due to maneuvering around Minnehaha Creek. The motor line went all the way to 50th and Nicollet Avenue. At 50th was the Washburn Memorial Orphan Asylum. It had been bequeathed in the will of Governor Cadwallader Washburn. Besides being a governor of Wisconsin and a general in command of cavalry at Vicksburg during the Civil War, He also was a co-founder of the Washburn-Crosby Company that would become General Mills. The bequeathment was in the sum of $375,000. Here is a photograph of the Washburn Memorial Orphan Asylum. And here are the orphans waiting for visitors most likely disembarking from the motor line. The orphanage accepted all children regardless of heritage or religion. It accepted abandoned children or half-orphans where one parent had passed. The route to the lakes was actually the first to be built after the downtown Lyndale route. It went west on West 31st and headed to Lake Calhoun. On the lake the colonel had a pavilion built. In 1880 he went south to Lake Harriet following today's Richfield Boulevard, then down the west side of Harriet on the track bed that the Como-Harriet streetcar line uses today. Again it stopped at another pavilion. After Lake Harriet the line followed west 44th past Hopkins, and then almost due west to Minnetonka. By the way, the route down 31st and the pavilion had the first electric lights other than the bridge square downtown. Winter nights were wonderful skating on Lake Calhoun under the lights. After Hopkins the route went through the village of Minnetonka and then to Excelsior, finishing at the docks. The motor line was officially called the Lyndale Railway Company, where Colonel McCrory changed its name to the Minneapolis, Lyndale and Minnetonka Railway Company when the route extended to Lake Minnetonka. It was one of the earliest urban railroads in the country and went through 3 different locomotive power systems. The first was a steam engine. It was small and somewhat disguised as a car. About the only obvious sign it was a steam engine was the small smokestack on top the lead car. Here is a newspaper sketch from the Minneapolis Daily Times of the motor line steam engine running down the east bank of Lake Calhoun towards Lake Harriet. There was criticism of the motor lines as coal-burning steam engines. Colonel McCrory's engines burned high-quality coal that were sparkless or nearly so, and the firebox did not drop hot clinkers on the street, but the people had been schooled to distrust the safety of steam engines. The large over-the-road locomotives did drop clinkers and the big wood-burning locomotives did emit sparks. Sparks from a wood-burning locomotive was the believed source of the Great Hinckley Fire. In the sketch is steamboat cruising Lake Calhoun. Although it is not too clear the steamboat is named the Hattie, maybe just a coincidence, Colonel's daughter, Harriet, was nicknamed Hattie. Colonel McCrory looked at electricity. From 1880 to 1884 many inventors showed electric trains at fairs or short demonstration runs on existing horse line track. But nothing any place was like the 1883 motor line electric train. It used Charles Joseph Van Diepoel's 50-horsepower electric motor. The engine pulled 5 cars loaded with people and used Van Diepoel's overhead electrification. The overhead electrification wasn't that difficult in the city, but the 15-mile run from Lake Harriet to the Excelsior docks on Lake Minnetonka was a long haul with lots of poles and lots of wire. Next, Colonel McCrory tried the soda motor. Now, we are talking about a one-of-a-kind in the Western Hemisphere. A few caustic soda engines operated in Germany, and maybe one was imported to New York City as an experiment. The motor line's caustic soda locomotives were built by Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia. Caustic soda is sodium hydroxide, and also generically known as lye. When heated water or steam is added to sodium hydroxide, a chemical reaction creates heat that in turn can turn more water to steam. The soda motor was just another way to make steam to drive the pistons. At night the lye water solution was drained out of the boiler and heated with cheap low-grade coal to boil off the water, making the caustic soda concentrated again and ready to use the next day. Here is a photograph of the motor line boys. They are in front of one of their later steam engines. In the original photo, the photographer has highlighted Colonel McCrory. The colonel at this time is using acronyms instead of a full name of his urban railroad. The author is just guessing that this picture is about 1885, but he has no idea of where. With the locomotive power more or less solved, the colonel's attention turned to Lake Minnetonka. The cities of Excelsior, Minnetonka Beach, and Wayzata had upscale accommodations and dining. Here is an 1896 map of the lake. The colonel's motor line coming from Minneapolis is shown in red and goes to the city of Excelsior. To the northeast through pretty open water is Wayzata. To the northwest, through some tight spots, is Minnetonka Beach. This formed the Golden Triangle on Lake Minnetonka. As a side note, in the late summer of 1884, The Society of the Army of the Tennessee held their 17th annual meeting at the Lafayette Hotel in Minnetonka Beach. The society was essentially an alumni association of the soldiers and their wives of the Army of the Tennessee. The Army of the Tennessee was named after the Tennessee River. The definite article word, the, the, for them is always in front the word Tennessee. The Confederates had an Army of Tennessee named after the state of Tennessee with no the word. General William Tecumseh Sherman was the president of the society and had been since the death of General John Rawlins. Rawlins had been the Secretary of War and died in September of 1869. General Grant did not attend the reunion. From a letter he wrote to General Sherman giving his regrets, it is very likely he knew he had throat cancer, but he did not go into details. It would not be announced until early October. In addition, on May 4 of that year, the Ferdinand Ward Pyramid Investors scheme brought down the Grants, Marine National Bank, and many others. It was not called the Ponzi scheme back then because Charles Ponzi was only 2 years old. In the letter, the general indicates he is working on an article about the Battle of Shiloh and the Vicksburg campaign for Century magazine. With the help of Mark Twain, the general wrote his memoirs for publisher J.J. Little and Company. The 2-volume set has over 1,200 pages. The general received a pension from the government, but it would not pass on to Julia, his wife. Their 4 children were not doing well at the time. Julia would have been living on charity. The general finished the memoirs 2 weeks before his death. His memoirs were a financial and literary success. Julia lived on after the general's death, financially comfortable. This Army of the Tennessee medal was actually worn at the meeting by Captain Andrew C. Kemper. His name says stamped in the top brass bar. In all, 32 generals attended the reunion. A few had not been in the Army of the Tennessee or the Department of the Tennessee, but lived locally and were acting in some way as a host. At the end of this video, a mini biography of each of the generals will be given. Here is an overhead photograph of how Minnetonka Beach looks today. Today's Lafayette Club with golf course and boat dock is near to where Lafayette Hotel stood back in 1884. The hotel burned down in the fall of 1897. Before leaving the original Lafayette Hotel, that was built in 1883, it is worthwhile noting its national presence from an architectural standpoint. Its owner was James J. Hill. The architect was Leroy Buffington. He was located in St. Paul and was nationally famous. Based on the Lafayette Hotel, Buffington designed the National Hotel in Yellowstone. In 1906 it was added onto, and today we know it as the old National Mammoth Springs Hotel. The National Hotel that was based on the Lafayette became an icon of the national park system. Yellowstone was the first national park. Then the copycats came. Here is the old Glacier Park Lodge in Glacier National Park. From some angles, El Tovar Hotel in the Grand Canyon looks similar. If the Lafayette Hotel had been on super steroids, it may look like the hotel in Banff National Park in Canada. Now we will go back south from the British possession, as Canada was called during the Civil War, to the Army of the Tennessee. The Army of the Tennessee did more to win the Civil War than any of the other armies, with strategic battles and usually with decisive victories. Just a few notes on this list. The Union forces entered a nearly empty town in the First Corinth. Most of the Confederates had left. The Vicksburg campaign was by far the most complicated action in the Civil War. The Battle of Chattanooga was 2 battles, Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain. The Atlanta campaign included a series of battles. The N designation on the left means Union naval involvement. The letter A means other Union armies were involved. General Sherman was the president of the Society of the Army of the Tennessee and had been since 1869. It is far beyond a coincidence that General Sherman picked Lake Minnetonka as the site of the big get-together, with the commander of his old bodyguard, Colonel McCrory, being the host on committees and founder and president of the scenic transportation means to and from the Lafayette Hotel to downtown Minneapolis. General Sherman had retired from his position as commanding general of the Army 10 months prior on November 1, 1883. He had preceded President and General Ulysses S. Grant, who had been commanding general until March 4, 1869, when he became president. General Philip Sheridan preceded General Sherman. The next commanding general of the Army was General John Schofield. All 4 generals can point to fighting in the state of Tennessee in 1863 and or 1864. The four generals together commanded the army for 40½ years. In addition to the Society of the Army of the Tennessee holding their 17th annual meeting out on the lake, the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic had just held their 18th encampment in Minneapolis. The tents were pitched at the old fairgrounds near the Mississippi River, and the arch shown is on 4th Avenue and Washington Avenue downtown. The Minneapolis Tribune estimated that 100,000 veterans attended. Here is a photograph of Bridge Square during the GAR encampment. There were parades and more parades with speeches and recollections. A local newspaper recognized the veterans with a big banner. The city's alternating political department made for competition in the mayor's office of producers with industry-recognized names like DeLater, Rand, and Pillsbury. The city had two different Winstons as mayors. One Winston rode as an officer in the 5th Virginia Cavalry of the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. The populace of the city was interested in honor, recognition, and the ability to produce. Now for the steamboat that was eventually called the Zillah. The author points out that some of the documentation he presents is not substantial, that is, it can't be double verified, but it all works with the timeline and other records. In 1882 or 1883, Colonel McCrory had a steamboat manufacturer in Iowa build an excursion steamboat. The author believes it was Iowa Iron Works of Dubuque, Iowa. They were arguably the most capable riverboat manufacturer ever. They built the SS Sprague, the world's biggest stern-wheeler towboat that could push 60 barges of coal, weighing 67,307 tons. The top of the 60 barges covered an area the size of 6½ acres, that is equal to 4.92 American football fields including end zones. Appropriately, the Sprague was called the Big Mama, and worked from 1891 to 1948. At the time the Colonel's boat was being built, by the only likely builder, the Iowa Iron Works, they actually built 4 boats, 3 that were excursion boats and a 4th one that had a superstructure typical of a small riverboat. This excursion star sailed Lake Minnetonka. The sister ships of the excursion star up in Minnesota were the steamers Okoboji and the Queen down in Iowa. As you can see, the star and the Okoboji have identical canopies over the wheelhouse. The roof of the Queen's wheelhouse is flat and has a nautical spotlight on top. The photo of the Queen is from the 1890s. In 1880 the SS Columbia and in 1883 the USS Trenton got electric lights. Starting about 1885 some boats that worked in the dark got electric lights. Here is a photograph of the Okoboji and the Queen on Lake Okoboji. It was taken around 1915. We can use a photo manipulation program to remove the small boat in the foreground. The two are definitely sisters. Both have had the wheelhouse reworked and both have a nautical light on top. The Okoboji was retired in 1922 or 1923. The Queen sailed out of Arnold's Park on Lake Okoboji until 1973, and then she went to Adventureland's River City in Altoona, Iowa. There, she sailed around a pond on hidden tracks below the water pretending she was a riverboat. About 1977 she was permanently moored and featured Dixie land bands, drinks and food. She disappeared in the mid-1980s. Colonel McCrory's boat was 78 feet long and 40 tons. It came up the Mississippi River and then the Minnesota River. In some way it was parted out or it was shipped in parts, that would have been the hull, boiler, engine, deck and superstructure. The author is just guessing, but by looking at old road maps and especially terrain maps, he thinks the pieces came ashore in the lowlands east of Chaska. Then were pulled on huge freighters by oxen or mules north on what is roughly today's Audubon Road, then somewhere crossing over to today's Powers Boulevard, then north on Powers to Excelsior. For reference, here is Chaska, here is Lake Ann, and here is Chanhassen. The pieces were assembled at Solberg's Point on Lake Minnetonka. It is on the road over the narrow strip of land that goes from Excelsior to today's old log cabin theater. For some reason, the build process took greater than a year and the boat wasn't launched until July 14, 1884. The launch was a mess, the boat got stuck and had to be towed out. It did sail but had a list. A list means it tilted to one side or the other. A list is caused by not longitudinally centering heavy gear with respect to the keel. 30 days after the launch of McCrory's boat, the Society of the Army of the Tennessee held its big get-together at the Lafayette Hotel. On the first day, starting at page 88 of the official proceedings, McCrory and General Sherman, the president and presiding officer, were bantering about a proposal from McCrory. The essence of the back and forth is that McCrory will give free rides to society members on his new boat and on his urban railroad between Minneapolis and Excelsior. The members of the Army of the Tennessee are invited to go down to the wharf at the hotel at 11 o'clock the following morning on August 14, 1884 for a ride, or at least to see the new steamboat that desperately needs a name. The author believes that boat was tentatively named the Ulysses after General Ulysses S. Grant, the first commander of the Army of the Tennessee. The SS Ulysses sailed Lake Minnetonka, but not too well. She got stuck at times. Her draft of 3 feet was too much, especially in late summer. The locals morphed the name Ulysses into useless. The author believes Colonel McCrory could not accept the affront to the great general. For those into old Lake Minnetonka, that is Breezy Point, about 1890. It must have been good fishing. Just as Lake Okoboji had 2 different queens sailing at the same time in the late 1800s, the author believes Lake Minnetonka had 2 different boats named the Star. The top queen here is usually referred to as Steamer Queen, the bottom queen is the queen number 1. Back to Lake Minnetonka. The author believes Colonel McCrory abandoned the name Ulysses and changed it to the Star. The first specific reference the author can find to the Colonel's Star is in the Star Tribune of Sunday, May 24, 1885. The article tells about a youth outing of the Westminster Presbyterian Church. The McCrorys were Presbyterian, and Harriet, his daughter nicknamed Hattie, would have been about 11 years old. But there was another star on the lake that usually was called, at least in writing, the Steamer Star. It was owned by a businessman, a Mr. Minor Ball of Delano in Wright County, Minnesota. Searching for a boat named Star in a market where leading newspaper is the Star Tribune is enough to make a sane man come off the rails. Now that we know there are 2 boats named Star on the lake, owned by 2 different people, details now pop out looking at old photographs of the boats named Star. These photographs are in the Minnesota Historical Archives as well as historical societies on the lake. Here is the one star that we already seen. Let's put this star up in the corner. Let's look at this photograph of a boat also identified as the Star. Here is the star enlarged. Adjusting for the perspective, and if the door is about 6 foot 6 inches, the length of this boat in feet was in the mid-70s. Check out the wheelhouse. Now let's get a better look at this star's wheelhouse from another photograph in the archives. Let's expand it. First, it does have the fancy canopy like the other boats from Iowa Iron Works. There is no name on the boat's hull, wheelhouse, or anywhere that we can see. The 12-sided wheelhouse looks toyishly ornamental, and how do you get up there? There is no upper deck seating or any other outside seating for passenger wanting to enjoy a sunny summer excursion on the lake. Whoever owns the boat had a smallish riverboat. It definitely is not an excursion boat, and the Colonel knew transportation extremely well. He operated the side paddle wheeler excursion boat, the Hattie, on Lake Calhoun. We can only guess what river business the owner had in mind when he ordered it. Maybe it was supposed to work the upper Mississippi to St. Cloud? Because it was propeller-driven and an enclosed passenger cabin, it could work most of the year except for maybe 3 winter months. The paddle wheelers were nearly useless when there was even a small amount of ice on the river or the temperatures were below freezing. As we look at it, it is obviously work in progress. Through that big opening in front, we should see at least something of the propulsion system, the firebox, or boiler, or engine. There is nothing there. It looks like we are only seeing the hull and superstructure. The boat is being finished. It needs propulsion and maybe a superstructure reworked to make it into an excursion boat. Look closely at the bow and now look at the finial decorative edge work on top. The bow and the shape of the hull looks like wood to the author. Now we will add the photographs of the riverboat Star to the previous excursion Star. Even though the forward superstructure has changed and an upper deck seating added, the bow and finial edge are the same in all 3 pictures. The small riverboat was changed into an excursion boat in a year's time. That is a pretty good testimony, at least to one shipyard on Lake Minnetonka. Here is the record of these photographs and the date of creation. The author believes this star was owned by Mr. Ball of Delano, and unfortunately we do not have a photograph of Colonel McCrory's star, but the next set of photographs will shed light on what the Colonel's star may have looked like. Before seeing the reworked and resold rendition of the Colonel's boat, let's look at the Iowa boats from a side view. The top is the Okoboji, also with that ornamental wheelhouse. Using proportional measurements and math, it would be almost 90 feet. That is a pretty good-sized excursion boat. The Queen is at the bottom. She measures almost 70 feet. The Colonel's boat, measuring 78 feet, would be somewhere in between. These propeller-driven boats were a dream to maneuver and dock compared to the broad-beam paddle-wheelers. One could dock 3 or 4 of the propeller-driven boat to what a broad-beam paddle-wheeler needed. Most important for the discussion to come, look at the bow of these 2 steel-hull boats made by the Iowa Iron Works. Here is the boat bearing the name of Clyde. This photograph is in the archives of the Minnesota Historical Society and the Excelsior Lake Minnetonka Historical Society. The author has the rights to use it. The boat in the background is the steamer, the Hebe. Let's use an image manipulation program and delete the Hebe. The star was reworked to eliminate the list. There is no canopy over the upper deck, but will be when she is Zillah of Lake Yellowstone. There is no upper deck forward passenger seating area. The Colonel sold his star in 1888 to Donald Kennedy and Howard Trumbull, and they renamed the star the Clyde. The Colonel was one of the first to build an urban railroad of any kind. He was the first to have a long-distance electric-powered urban railroad. He was the only person in the Western Hemisphere to have a soda motor locomotive, and the star was the first steamer on Lake Minnetonka with a condensing compound steam engine. The Iowa Iron Works steel hull bow is clearly there. A compound engine is like a car engine. There are multiple cylinders with internal pistons that, through connecting rods, drive a crankshaft that turns the propeller shaft and the propeller. The compound steam engine had already been used in the textile industry, but what made this engine special was the condensing and the lubricant system. This steam engine was a closed system. That is, a boiler heated water to high-pressure steam. The high-pressure steam drove the piston and became low-pressure steam. The low-pressure steam then went through a radiator that was being cooled by water from the lake, and the lower-pressure steam condensed back to water. Because the system was closed, a lubricant, probably some form of animal tallow, could be added to the steam water to lubricate and reduce wear between pistons and cylinder walls. Besides wear, the lubricant allowed for higher revolution per time and higher pressures, resulting in higher horsepower. After the star, the engine caught on widely. Ultimately, the county sheriff tried to control steamboat racing on Lake Minnetonka. The engine kept evolving, and by the end of World War II, 2,710 Liberty ship had been built in 18 shipyard. Each Liberty had 2 oil-fired boilers that drove 2 triple-expansion condensing compound engines. Most of the Liberty ships were named for people, and many after ladies, from the shootist Annie Oakley to the seductive Hollywood actress Carole Lombard. Back in a different time, Miss Lombard patriotically went on a tour selling Liberty bonds and died in a plane crash. This picture of the christening of the SS Lombard was taken 2 years after her death. That is actress Irene Dunn smashing the champagne bottle on the bow of the ship, and that is Captain Clark Gable, the widower, looking on. Another Liberty ship was named after General Grenville M. Dodge. Colonel McCrory's connection to Dodge will come up shortly. By 1886, the Colonel was back into real estate. The local newspapers attribute much of the Minneapolis Industrial Exposition building to the Colonel but do not go into detail. The building was at 101 Central Avenue Southeast. For reference, if you go the southern tip of Nicollet Island then cross to the east bank of the Mississippi, you would be where the Exposition building once stood. The building hosted machinery exhibitions, concerts by the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra, and other events, but became a warehouse in the 1930s. It was torn down in 1940, except for the tower that came down in 1945 to build a Coca-Cola bottling plant on the site. The Colonel played an important role in getting the 1892 Republican National Convention to Minneapolis using the Exposition building. He chaired committees that dealt with transportation and accommodations. The incumbent President Benjamin Harrison was running. He had been a division commander in General Sherman's Atlanta campaign, and he fought at the Battle of Nashville. James Blaine of Maine, the oldest of the candidates, was also running, and as a member of the House of Representatives had been a staunch supporter of President Lincoln. William McKinley was the youngest and was in the thick of battle at Antietam Creek and the Shenandoah Valley. He was a captain in one of the war's nastiest small battle, Cedar Creek. Together the three made up the party's leadership. Colonel McCrory knew Harrison and McKinley. That fall, President Harrison lost to also former President, Democrat Grover Cleveland, who, when drafted during the Civil War, bought his way out the war for $150. Maybe the most notable event at the convention was that Teresa Alberta Jenkins became the first woman delegate of a major party at their national convention. She was born in Wisconsin and represented Wyoming at the convention. Colonel McCrory was forced out his railroad company in August of 1885 when William Drew Washburn sold $139,000 in bonds he was carrying on the motor line to Charles Pillsbury. William D. was the brother of Cadwalader C., whom we heard about earlier. Both were co-founders of the Washburn-Crosby Mills. Just one thing before leaving William D. He built a mansion of mansions occupying an entire city block adjacent to today's Minnesota Institute of Art. The building began in 1883. It cost $1.6 million then to build. Here is an 1886 photograph. William D.'s heirs gave it to the city in 1910 and the city demolished it in 1924. Today it is a city park. As mentioned before, McCrory sold the Star. Even after rework, the boat named Clyde had trouble navigating the shallow water of the lake. When the lake was low, the boat's full 3-foot draft made certain channels on the lake too shallow to navigate. When the lake was low, the Clyde stayed tied up at the docks. The locals started calling the Clyde the Useless, as they had done when Colonel McCrory owned the boat. It would not be until 1895, when the Grays Bay Dam was built and controlled the outlet water into Minnehaha Creek, that the lake level would be semi-controlled. In 1924, dredging began on the lake to deepen the main channels. Kennedy and Trumbull had renamed the boat the Clyde. Maybe in their minds, the name Clyde was as far away from Star or Useless as you could get. This print is from the archives of the Wayzata Historical Society. The steamboat scene is not the Star or Clyde, but is a great depiction of early boating on the lake. Before ending this story of the steamboat and its final days on Yellowstone Lake, it is worth mentioning the Colonel McCrory's national presence. The colonel served on 2 committees headed by General Grenville Dodge. The first was the General Sherman Statue Committee. This statue features General Sherman on top and recognizes the Army of the Tennessee's other commanders and the Corps commanders. The monument is located southeast of the White House. The second committee that Colonel McCrory was on with General Dodge was a subset of the GMA, the Grant Monument Association. In 1892, General Horace Potter became the 4th president of the association. General Dodge was vice president in his usual behind-the-scenes role. After photo ops and a lot of blustering, the first 3 presidents had raised only $155,000 of the $475,000 needed for a design that fell short with little interior features. General Dodge became a vice president in the executive committee of the GMA. Besides building or consulting on 11 railroads, Dodge was a banker. He founded a bank in Council Bluffs, Iowa. He was vice president of Washington Bank of New York. He lived at East 60th and Park Avenue, about 2 blocks from the southeast corner of Central Park in New York City. General Dodge took charge of raising money to build Grant's tomb and to be the Grand Marshal of the parade to dedicate the tomb. To raise the money, General Dodge and his committee, that include Colonel McCrory, held 2 birthday parties in honor of General Grant. The 2 parties featured some of the most lavish food and posh venue the North American continent ever saw. To have been invited, one must be rich, really rich, and to have one's checkbook handy. It had taken 7 years to raise the first $155,000. It took Dodge and his committee just over 2 years to raise an additional $450,000 to build a redesigned tomb with more interior space. Mrs. Julian Dent Grant, the general's wife, broke ground the day after the first birthday party, on the redesigned mausoleum with spacious interior and a place for her when she passed. The Grant Monument Association was a success. Dodge went on to be the Grand Marshal and command the marching of 60,000 men in front of 2 million people. He had done that just a month before, but for fewer people at President McKinley's first inauguration. And 32 years before the dedication of General Grant's tomb, General Dodge had taken charge of the military procession for President Lincoln's burial in Springfield, Illinois. General Dodge's committee, which at one time included Colonel McCrory, commissioned this painting. Unfortunately, the colonel died 2 months before the second birthday party. At a parade in Minneapolis preceding the November 1892 national election, Colonel McCrory's horse reared back, slipped, and fell on the colonel. Colonel McCrory suffered significant damage to his back and head. To some degree he started to recover. In early February of 1893 he took his only daughter, Harriet, who was 19, to see her step-grandparents, Grandma Mary and Grandpa General Brinkerhoff. Harriet was born to the colonel's first wife Clorinda Garrett, who died when Harriet was 5. Then the colonel remarried when Harriet was 8 to Mary Brinkerhoff. Mary died when Harriet was 18, and less than a year later her father died while staying at the Brinkerhoff's house. Clorinda, Mary, and William are buried together in the Mansfield Cemetery, Mansfield, Ohio. Harriet, the daughter, married, had children, and became a professional in the public library system in Hamburg, New York. 1889 was a dry year. The water level was low on Lake Minnetonka and Old Clyde was useless again. Howard Trumbull, who was then full owner, sold the boat to the Lake Boat Company of Yellowstone National Park. Colonel E.C. Waters was the president of the company and a primary concessionaire on Yellowstone Lake. The boat, 78 feet long and 40 tons, was disassembled in Wayzata or Excelsior, then loaded on railroad flatbed cars and interlined to the Northern Pacific trackage just north of downtown Minneapolis. From Minneapolis it rolled west on the Northern Pacific's main line until reaching Livingston, Montana, then south on a spur to Cinnabar, Montana. Cinnabar is no more and was 3 miles from the park's entrance. Those last 3 miles were difficult construction for a line that would be used less than half the year. It would not be finished until 1903, 20 years after it started, when the railroad would get to Gardner, Montana, the northern entrance to the park. The boat in pieces made the last 20 miles by wagon freighter to the lake. The boiler alone weighed over 6 tons. It was successfully transported and reassembled, finishing in 1890. There was bad blood between E.C. Waters and Thomas Oakes, the president of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Back in 1888, E.C. Waters was showing Thomas Oakes the park. Oakes was investigating the park as a business adventure for himself or the Northern Pacific. The two gentlemen and most likely others visited one of the geysers. E.C. Waters soaked the geyser. Soap breaks down the surface tension of the water and lubricates the rocks of the fissure in which the steamy hot water will rise. Basically, it is geyser on demand and damages the geyser to some degree. The park administration, with military backing, had Oakes and Waters arrested. Waters had influence and was somehow connected to Russell Harrison, President Benjamin Harrison's son. Both were released, but Thomas Oakes was probably greatly embarrassed. Probably despite Thomas Oakes, E.C. Waters renamed the Clyde, the metal tub of a boat, after Oakes' daughter Zillah Oakes. Riding on Zillah, the boat, to visit the zoo on Dot Island, staying at the Yellowstone Lake Hotel with a side trip to see the geysers was one of the must things to do if out west. In 1891, Zillah, the daughter, accompanied her father on a western trip. Definitely the president of the Northern Pacific had the money to live it up and do everything. The trip was a combination business and pleasure trip. Although there are several versions of the story, all agree that Zillah, the attractive 19-year-old diva, was quite upset and cried nearly continuously. We do not know if Zillah, the young lady, used to riding in private railroad cars, was upset that a smoky, noisy boat was named after her, or because she did not get to ride on Zillah because her father and E.C. Waters were still carrying on their 3-year-old feud. The Northern Pacific did eventually decide to take advantage of its closeness to Yellowstone Park on the north side, as this 1904 advertisement indicates. By 1908, the Union Pacific had adopted the park as theirs too, as shown in the photograph of an exhibit at the 1915 Panama Pacific World Exposition in San Francisco. This walk-around replica of the Old Faithful Inn was huge and required 2 million board feet of lumber, and there was a geyser that went off hourly. The Union Pacific patronized the park until the end of the 1968 season. The United States Postal Department ended paying the railroads in 1967 to transport mail, often in mail cars where sorting took place. Without the payments for mail transportation, the passenger train business became unprofitable for most of the year for most of the railroads. Now the government greatly subsidizes passenger business on Amtrak. The author of this video was a tour conductor for one of the last Union Pacific tours to the park, taking his tour to the Old Faithful Inn in June of 1967. The business portion of the trip was for Thomas Oakes to finish some details of the Northern Pacific's participation with the Sunnyside Irrigation Project in the Yakima Valley. The project had been championed by General Sprague, who we heard about earlier. The old general was sick and suffering and would die 2 years later. Beside helping to get water to the valley, a county was named after General Sprague. He founded Tacoma, Washington, where he died. He also was the father of Catholic Gonzaga College in Spokane. He was not a priestly father but the father that gave the school its land. Zillah still cried even after traveling across parts of Montana, Idaho, and into Washington. To get Zillah to stop crying, as the story goes, Thomas Oakes said that a site that coincided with his railroad and with the Sunnyside Irrigation Canal would be named Zillah. It could have been as simple as her father saying, "Since that bad old boat is named Zillah, I will name a wonderful town after you." Today it is a lovely town, of about 3,200 people, and it is well known for its wine. Unfortunately for Zillah, the town was not the end of her name being used. In this 1921 advertisement, Zillah, the girl with X-ray eyes, was doing the vaudeville circuit. This ad was from a Casper, Wyoming newspaper. Now back to Zillah the boat. Zillah was hugely popular and very capable. On her maiden voyage, the crew let her rip. She hauled stern across the lake at 15 miles per hour, covering 20 miles in 1 hour and 20 minutes. The guests, after seeing the geysers and getting a whiff of hydrogen sulfide, were ready for a half day on Lake Yellowstone. The lake was one of the most pristine places on the planet, being iced in and unvisited by humans for often 9 months a year. In 1904, over 4,000 passengers rode the Zillah in a typical 3-month season on the lake. E.C. Waters managed the Zillah until he was kicked out of the park. In case some of you engineers, scientists, or maybe artists who have focused on details, the Zillah did undergo changes from the days of being Clyde. Of course, there were not women on top of the wheelhouse back in Minnesota, but this was Wyoming, the equality state, the foremost state on women's liberation. The smokestack is shorter because the fuel is probably some kind of petroleum rather than wood or coal. The passenger space around the wheelhouse has been increased and some braces added. The rear 3/4 of the boat is very much the Clyde. Now look at forward hull and bow. It is the steel hull design as we've seen on the Clyde, and the 2 Iowa boats. The high bow would have appreciated in bad weather on Lake Yellowstone. The lake is large with open water. 14 miles across and 18 miles longitudinally. E.C. Waters broke away from the boat company under park ownership and started his own company. The 125-passenger Zillah had cost $20,000 plus transportation and reassembly cost. E.C. Waters wanted more, a monumental boat, and of course it would be named after himself. Probably with a mixture of his own money, a lot of credit, and other investors, he ordered a 500-passenger steamer from one of the Dubuque, Iowa steamboat builders for $60,000. Here is the Zillah and the E.C. Waters in the background. Here is the finished E.C. Waters. The E.C. Waters may have carried the crew and a few guests, but it was never certified to carry the 500 passengers per design. The problem was not the boat but the owner. In 1907, the park board was fed up with Colonel Eli Collins Waters and banned him for life from the park system unless pardoned by the Secretary of the Interior. That did not happen. Any umbrella he had had from President Harrison was over. Harrison had died in 1901. Even his self-brevetted rank of colonel was in question, although he served. He had been a young teen at the time of the Civil War. By 1907, the Zillah was in poor shape. Waters, banking on the 500-passenger E.C. Waters becoming his revenue stream, ignored needed repairs on Zillah. In 1907, Thomas Elwood Hofer took over the park's boat company and ran it until 1910. During his tenure, he had the company invest in the Jean D shown here. She was maneuverable with twin screws and 120 horsepower gasoline engines. In 1910, the Yellowstone Park Boat Company took over Hofer's assets. The new company was financed by the Northern Pacific Railroad. This photograph might have been taken during World War I. The tourist business dropped off drastically, and during the war the park was closed. E.C. Waters, the boat, would have cost over $2 million in 2023 money to build, transport, and assemble. It never carried a paying passenger. Thomas Hofer and neither did his successors certify it. Its ownership may have been too messy, or they felt the size of the Jean D and smaller boats was better suited for the lake and tourist. The EC Waters was too big to be easily pulled ashore for winter, so the boat was stored in a sheltered cove on Stevenson Island. It was safe from the elements until the 1920-1921 winter, when the ice built up and wind pushed it ashore, probably damaging the hull, rudder and propeller shaft. Here is a picture of the EC Waters taken in the 1930s rotting away. No one knows for sure what happened to Zillah. Robert V. Goss, a park historian, believes she lasted until 1926. She probably was salvaged, scrapped, and scuttled. That is, salvage any useful equipment, scrap any valuable metal like brass, and scuttle whatever is left. In 1995, these photographs of a shipwreck were taken. Maybe this is whatever was left of the Zillah. Most mysterious disappearances of a ship are complete with a ghost story about the doomed passenger and crew getting revenge on someone. No humans were aboard when the Zillah went down, if that wreck is her. But more than one park ranger claimed they have heard strange animal sounds coming from Dot Island, where the zoo was long ago, when the moon is full over the park. Who knows? Maybe there are animal spirits trapped on the island, waiting for human visitors to come and give them treats, as they did 120 years ago. Here is the index of the generals that attended the Society of the Army of the Tennessee meeting in Minnetonka Beach. The society started when General Blair called for an impromptu meeting to see if there was interest in a veterans group of the Army of the Tennessee. The meeting took place on April 14, 1865 in the Senate chambers of the North Carolina Capitol building in occupied Raleigh, North Carolina. The war was ending. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered 5 days prior. Confederate General Joseph Johnston, learning of Lee's surrender that day, sent a message to General Sherman. A meeting of the two commanding generals was set for April 16. At Blair's impromptu meeting on the 14th, the group elected General William B. Woods to be president. That evening, President Lincoln was assassinated. On April 25, 1865, General Wood called for a meeting again at the Senate chambers in North Carolina. It was recognized as the organizational meeting. General Blair nominated General Rawlins to be president, and Rawlins was so elected, although he was not at the meeting or in North Carolina. The first annual meeting took place in 1866 in Cincinnati. The second in November of 1867 in St. Louis. The third in December of 1868 in Chicago. General Rawlins was the president of record at the 1869 reunion, but he had died a month before of consumption. General Grenville Dodge, the senior vice president, marched the dignitary members and guests into the meeting, including Generals Sheridan and Schofield. After opening remarks and business reports, General Dodge nominated General Sherman to be president, and Sherman was elected. There was no 1870 meeting. At the 1871 meeting in Cincinnati, General Sherman, president of the society, was on his 10-month tour of Europe and the Middle East. In a correspondence, he opened membership of the society to the Department of the Tennessee in addition to the Army of the Tennessee. This essentially made about anyone who ever fought in Tennessee during the Civil War on the Union side eligible for membership. This included 3 United States presidents, many cabinet members, foreign ambassadors, judges, governors, congressmen, the author of Ben-Hur, and the railroad builders. General Sherman was the president until his death in 1891, and then General Dodge took over as president. Besides Dodge's contributions before mentioned, one of his most ambitious projects was the General Grant Memorial in front of the U.S. Capitol building. He selected the artist, architect, and design. Dodge's friend William Hepburn of Clarinda, Iowa, who was in the cavalry at Vicksburg and the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, pushed the construction through under the 1902 Hepburn Act. General Dodge kept the Washington, D.C. Grant Memorial on track and stayed active in the society until his death in 1916. The planned 1916 reunion did take place, and General Fallows became the president. The society did not meet but only corresponded until 1922. Bishop General Samuel Fallows was born in England, raised and educated in Wisconsin. He was a chaplain and rose to the rank of brevet brigadier general. He was the bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States. At 86 years old, he presided over the dedication of the General Grant Memorial on April 27, 1922, the 100th anniversary of General Grant's birth. Both President and Vice President of the United States spoke, and as well as General Pershing, the General of the Army. In addition, General Julian S. Carr, Commander-in-Chief of the United Confederate Veterans, spoke. Foremost, Carr praised the magnanimity of General Grant that he showed at Appomattox and dignifying respect Grant afforded all people. The society never met again. The Army of the Tennessee's job in history was done. 33 days later, at the opposite end of the National Mall, the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated. The war and its leaders were visually embedded in our history. Chaplain Fallows died 4 months later. Here are the generals that attended the 17th annual reunion at Minnetonka Beach in August of 1884.
Hello, this is Bob Swasena, the author and producer of this video, speaking to you from my history cave. Since I can write better than I can talk, I will let Joanna, a text-to-speech voice from Amazon Polly, carry on this narrative of history.
Hi again. Thank you for watching about this piece of history. I hope I've brought it out fairly. There is no wrong side or right side of history. People or events do not change the course of history, for they are the history. History is simply what was. Next, I wish to address copyrights. As of January 1, 2022, most creative work from 1926 and before are in public domain. Every year, another year from the past will become public domain. The exception, with respect to the work here, is where a picture has been taken of a photograph or a page of a book originally published at some time in the public domain past. The photographer claims his photo is new, is copyright material, and he can charge for usage. These claims are on somewhat shaky ground, as Hathi Trust Digital Library has gone through 4 legal decisions allowing them to make books digitalized by Google, public domain. Still, it is not completely settled law. The author has bought the photographs and rights to the 2 different stars that were on the lake, the SS Clyde and Hebe, and the SS Hattie from the Minnesota Historical Society. Also, the author has permission from the Excelsior Lake Minnetonka Historical Society, who also has rights to the Clyde Hebe image. The picture of the Lafayette Club is recent and the author has permission to use it. The dredging of Excelsior Bay is in public domain via Haughey Trust Digital Library. The Narrows is public domain. The Wayzata Historical Society has made this print available from their archives. A big thanks and recognition goes to the Geyser Bob website. Geyser Bob was actually a bus driver in Yellowstone in the early years of the 20th century. These 6 pictures are just a small amount of scenes and stories on the website. Last, the images from postcards are from the author's collection. I hope you enjoyed the story of the Soda Express and Zillah.